Okay, Liz, thanks so much for your time and making yourself available to talk to BroadAgenda. Just this week, the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, which you are the Deputy Chair of, has released a really interesting statement about the global response to COVID in relation to women and girls. And tell us about that. Why is the statement, well, why the need to release this statement?
Well, the Working Group for Women and Girls, Virginia, is a small group of independent experts to the United Nations and nation states. And we come from every corner of the world. What we were finding in each of our regions is that whilst COVID is first and foremost a human issue, it absolutely has some gendered dimensions. And initially, those dimensions were not being looked at. So we were hearing stories from across the world, particularly stories related to domestic and family violence, which was showing a threefold increase in many countries, mainly because of a quarantine and isolation requirements, the sheltering from home. So all of a sudden, women were being locked in with their abusers. It's interesting because we often think that home is a safe place for everyone, but for 980 million women across the world, that's almost a billion, home is the least safe place.
Almost a billion.
Almost a billion women. So you can see just that's one single example of the gender dimension, which was not being taken into account by governments, often well-intentioned governments, but they're just having no understanding of these types of issues. So that was the reason we decided to release a statement.
One of the things that the statement said that I thought was particularly interesting is that something that we've been saying here in Australia and certainly run a number of articles on BroadAgenda about is that the COVID pandemic disproportionately affects women and girls and beyond just violence. Can you give us a little bit of background there? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What is the UN, what sort of assessment has the UN Working Group made about that, the disproportionate impact?
You're absolutely right. It is disproportionately impacting on women. So where are the main areas? The fact is 70% of the global healthcare sector, so healthcare workers, are women. So women are disproportionately affected on the front lines of our COVID response. But not only that, when you look at the COVID response teams across the world, we've examined a lot of them. They have very low representation of women, often 10%. So women are absent from the decision making and also from the policy spaces in terms of nations' COVID responses. The other thing, sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just going to ask why. I was really staggered when I looked at some of the numbers involved there. Why is that?
I think why it is that in a period of crisis, we default back to what's normal, and what's normal is that men lead across the world. It's so interesting, isn't it, though, to see in that context, Virginia, the women leaders of nations who are leading at this time, and I'm thinking New Zealand, I'm thinking Germany, I'm thinking some of the Scandinavian nations, they actually seem to be having better results than many other nations. So, but I think our default position is that men lead. Oh yes, we'll try and find some women who we think could make a contribution, but across the world it's still very, very low. The other thing that we're seeing, though, is very much around care. So because of gendered norms, gendered stereotypes, what we know is unpaid work in every nation of the world is largely done by women. And when many people are working from home, in nations where that's possible, but women are working from home, their children are no longer in childcare, their older children are no longer at school, the elder care requirements are increasing, and not only that, all the domestic work at home is increasing as well, and this is falling disproportionately on the shoulders of women. And I'm just hearing so many stories of women, even women who are strong feminists and gender equality advocates, saying, I just never imagined that this would be my picture as well.
We have noticed that too, and we've spoken to a number of women here in Australia that have been suggesting this as well, that suddenly it's really confronting for them to be at home full time and I've got to include some of my colleagues in this, and find themselves grappling with managing children and a partner or a spouse at home, and falling to that default position of allowing him to have the quiet room, have the door shut, and everyone's got to be quiet because he's on a Zoom meeting, etc., etc. And the women are allowing themselves to sort of slide into that secondary role, and then they're cross with themselves for it. It's weird, isn't it?
Exactly. It's a double whammy. But you can see how it happens. And, you know, a couple of my colleagues that I've spoken to who are really strong feminists have said, well, the messaging that he is hearing, whether it's the messaging that's been given, but what he is hearing is that if he's not as productive or more productive from home, then he'll be the next one out the door. So, you know, they're the pressures I think that probably families are under as well, but particularly I see women are under the pressure to keep all these balls in the air as well as keep their job. So I think we can learn a lot from this period, and that's what I'm really keen to do, is to learn what is working and what doesn't work. Because the other thing is, Virginia, you know, the employer, your home now becomes our workplace. So in a sense, I'm co-opting the workplace, and that has a whole raft of ramifications. Once again, taking back to the domestic violence situation, if your home is my workplace, then any violence that's happening in your home also becomes an issue in terms of, you know, the connection between domestic violence and the workplace. So I think there's a whole lot of different issues that are playing out. The good thing is, though, that there is an opportunity to shift some of these fundamental norms, because everything's up in the air, really.
Well, isn't that the interesting thing too? I notice again on your statement, you say, you know, we can use this, and this is the UN working group saying this, we can use this time to reimagine and transform systems and society. So in a sense, dreadful as it is, it's also a massive opportunity, isn't it, to change the way we do things.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, even bringing it back here to Australia, I mean, for the first time ever, we have access to free childcare. I mean, there's some limitations to that policy.
Will it last, though?
Will it last? Firstly, who would have ever thought? And secondly, will it last? Now, it may not last in its current format, but actually it's no longer possible to say, oh, we'll never do that, because clearly we have.
And clearly it is possible. It's possible.
And clearly it's possible. Absolutely. And there's so many examples like that, because one of the things that we're seeing across the world, and it does disproportionately impact on women, is if there's no good social protection, that's in terms of universal health care, access to childcare and school, all those things, then women will be disadvantaged to a much greater extent, because it's women that are often doing the education, they're doing the care, the elder care, the child care. So this is an opportunity to reimagine social protection as well. And not only that, Virginia, while I'm on this subject, it's an opportunity to put care at the centre of societies, the economy, our well-being, and see what would shift when we put care. Because let's face it, that's the most important thing that's happening at the minute. You know, the care that's being provided, and it's not just by women, it's many men as well. But I think that's where the reimagining comes in.
Isn't it interesting too, yes, that suddenly even men who've never really considered this are talking about care and unpaid care in ways I haven't heard of before, as if this has suddenly become an issue when it's been an issue forever. But yeah, it's certainly an opportunity to reimagine the way we arrange and share unpaid care and unpaid work on the domestic sphere. But do you think, Liz, that, you know, I'd like to say at the end of all of this, and who knows when it's going to end, but do you really think that things will change? I mean, we've heard the Prime Minister himself talk about a snapback. And I've written about this. We must not snap back. I want to see a snap forward. But, you know, are we actually going to grasp the opportunity and really seize it, do you think?
Well, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. We need to snap forward, not snap back. And we need to learn from this period. I think it is about a reevaluation of a place of care, not just in our families, but in our lives, in our economy, in our society, and in our nation. And I mean, if we can take the opportunity, we actually can start to create a better world, a world which has less discrimination, systemic discrimination, a world where we value teachers and healthcare workers equally with finance and everything else. But what will it take? I mean, I'm loving at the minute though seeing, and just to give you one small example, a number of male CEOs that I work with, a part of a Male Champions of Change strategy, they're actually doing Zoom calls for men in their organisation to talk about the need to share unpaid work at home, just talking about how they're doing it, inviting others to share what they're finding in that situation, and then to discuss as an organisation where they want to be in that picture. And I just thought, you know, that's a really great, you know, a great initiative. Because one of the things that we know is that picture hasn't shifted in Australia for a very long time. So I'm hoping to see the time usage diaries, hopefully they'll be kept up, but that they will show some different division of unpaid work in the household.
Indeed. Again, on BroadAgenda, we've recently run a piece written by Julia Hare about the example shown by the General Manager of Austrade in China, who actually contacted over 30 of his own senior workers, all men, and told them that they have to do a webinar to look at this very issue of unpaid care at work and sharing it, and to get real about how they function in the home space whilst working. And I thought that was a really interesting initiative. I just want to, I know I've got to let you go, but I just want to circle back to the UN working group on discrimination against women and girls and the statement that you put out. In addition to explaining why this is necessary, there are a number of recommendations that you've made to governments around the world. And I thought it was really interesting that one of them gets to that really tricky area and very controversial area of sexual and reproductive health services.
Yeah.
Now, we're hearing some really disturbing news about how some nations are using the opportunity of the COVID pandemic as a smokescreen to introduce some really draconian legislation to wind back women's rights, particularly around sexual and reproductive health rights. What are you hearing?
You're absolutely right on that, Virginia. It's deeply worrying what we're hearing, and it's in most regions of the world, is that abortion is being categorised as an elective procedure, and therefore it is, as elective procedures are no longer proceeding, it's being held indefinitely, but you know, so that women essentially cannot access abortion services. Now that's happening in many countries, and even in some countries we're seeing more and more regression back to very strict areas of abortion. So I think that the other thing is we are seeing some issues with women who are giving birth at this time as well. You know, their babies immediately being taken away from them in certain situations, doctors wanting to perform, and you know, it is always a balance of public health and whatever, but you know, more forceps deliveries, invasive birth procedures as a way of accelerating birth and limiting the risk. So it's balancing and seeing what's proportionate. That's really important. But I do think this area of sexual health and reproductive rights in humanitarian crisis is something that we will have a very good look at over the next year. And that's one of the other great things. That's why I love being part of a working group. There's the opportunity, Virginia, also to actually see which countries did it well so far as applying a gender lens to also the stimulus payments that are coming into the market and other things. So where are the standout countries? And then the working group has the ability to undertake a country visit and to learn what were the initiatives that that particular nation put in place. And I think we'll be looking forward to doing that once we can start to travel to countries again.
And I suspect that some of those countries you'll be visiting to see who've done well will be those nations headed by women.
Yeah, I think not surprisingly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Liz, just what about you yourself? I know you've been in lockdown for quite some time. We held a terrific conference, the CSW moment, back on the 13th of March, which feels like another world ago now. And that was just before the crackdown. In fact, it was the last time we all gathered. And even then, you Skyped in rather than travel to Canberra to be with us. So you've been in lockdown for a long time. How are you going?
We were about 7 weeks now that we've been in lockdown, and with my team and everything, we've all been working solely from home for 7 weeks. So it's been an interesting process. I mean, we did a lot of remote work anyway, so moving to home entirely was not such a big step. But having said that, there's been some really positive aspects of it. We have been so engaged electronically, probably more engaged than we were physically pre-COVID. That's because people were in different states. So we've really got into a good rhythm around that. And we have one, at least one a week, which is a fancy dress, quarantine, whatever. So a whole range. We're trying to bring out our best creative initiatives. I have to say mine are a bit lacking. But we're also inviting people onto our Zoom calls from all over the world to get the different perspectives. So that's been fascinating as well. But I do notice after 7 weeks, you can go into a bit of a slump. It was all fun and interesting at the beginning, and now this is not a sprint, this is a marathon, and potentially it could be for many, many months. So it's about keeping the energy up, helping people understand in terms of self-care, you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before you help others. So what is it that you're doing for yourself? So we've had quite a few sessions on self-care, which I think is really important at the minute. I mean, for me, that's about doing more and more meditation. I love every morning I have my daily podcasts and some poetry and whatever. And then just being energized by people's stories at the minute. I mean, what a moment of global connection, a moment of human connection. And just to hear the stories, some of which are deeply troubling. Actually, I spoke to a colleague in Zimbabwe just a couple of weeks ago. Zimbabwe, where 90% of a population is involved in the informal economy, so they're working in public spaces, and the majority of those women. So when the lockdown and isolation strategies came through, it just means that people's livelihoods, are so badly damaged. And not only that, in that population of 15 million, they have one testing centre. Many people have no access to running water. I mean, it just reminds you also that this pandemic is impacting on people very, very differently, depending on your nation, your family, your economic, capability, your access to resources and power. And I think if it's the thing that I fear the most, Virginia, about this pandemic, and from my own what I'm seeing is, I fear that just the overwhelming human suffering might over time mean that you become numb to everything that's happening. And I think that's a great fear. So I'm trying to hold on to those bright spots, as I call them, the things that are energizing, that we're doing, the impact we're having where we can have impact, and just keeping moving forward.
Liz, it's interesting you mentioned that idea of becoming numb. I think, as a journalist, I know we become a little immune at times when, particularly during a crisis, because you just have to get on with your job. But what I have noticed is this flood of kindness around me at the moment, in a beautiful way. And I mean around my whole community. I'm out walking every day, a couple of times a day, and people I've never spoken to before, everyone wants to talk, everyone wants to say hello. But there's just this gentleness that we don't
Yeah.
see. I mean, I hope that's reflected in many, many places, and it's not just here. But I think I have found that encouraging, and people just being in contact, just say, "How are you going?" You know.
Yeah. Exactly. Just
little,
reaching out.
Yeah, and that little message can be just so uplifting. Someone you haven't heard of for a while, say, "How are you going?" Just thinking of you. You know, Anyway, look, unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave it there because I know you've got many, many more Zoom calls for this evening. But thank you so much for spending a bit of time with us, and it'll be so lovely to see you in person eventually, whenever that might be.
Thanks very much, Virginia, and thanks so much for inviting me on to BroadAgenda. As you know, I love it. It's one of the things that I read every single week. I just love everything you're doing down there. So thank you so much for that.
That is so lovely.
Okay.
I
See you,
really
Dom.
from the bottom of my heart.